Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting away the political rhetoric, ignoring the campaign speeches, and stepping right past the sensational headlines. Instead, we are putting on our economist hats and opening up the ledger. We're going to look purely at the data-driven reality of the U.S.-China economic conflict, specifically analyzing that massive gap between what policies intended to do and what actually happened to the macroeconomy. Seriously, what happens when two economic superpowers try to rewrite the rules of global trade using tariffs? Well, as we'll see, the fallout in the manufacturing sector and across global supply chains is an absolute masterclass in the law of unintended consequences.
Okay, let's dive right in. We've got four main areas to cover today: macroeconomic data changes, the real impacts on manufacturing, the massive global supply chain reshuffle, and finally, the long-term costs to global trade.
All right, part one, macroeconomic data changes.
To really grasp the structural impact on global trade, we have to start with the raw numbers. And wow, 145%. By 2025, after a whole series of compounding escalations, the United States slapped this staggering tariff on a huge array of Chinese goods. Now, for some context, before this whole conflict kicked off back in 2018, average tariffs were hovering way down in the single digits. So this was a blunt force economic tool designed to completely alter trade flows, curb alleged intellectual property theft, and, revitalize American domestic manufacturing.
But as basic game theory tells us, every action has a reaction. China immediately hit back, imposing a 125% retaliatory tariff on American goods. So what we're looking at here isn't just some standard negotiation tactic. It's essentially the construction of a massive financial wall between the two largest economies on the planet, which severely chokes off the natural flow of capital, components, and finished goods.
Now, here's where it gets incredibly ironic. Despite these historic trade barriers, which were literally intended to eliminate the U.S. trade deficit, the data shows China's overall global trade surplus actually grew. It jumped by 20% from 2024, hitting an absolute record of $1.19 trillion in 2025. You might be wondering, how on earth is that possible? Well, it turns out that blunt tariffs don't necessarily erase trade. They usually just redirect it. China just ramped up its exports to other regions to make up for the loss of the U.S. market.
And that brings us to a fundamental economic truth. Most economists will tell you that trade deficits aren't primarily caused by unfair trade policies. Actually, they're the result of deep macroeconomic factors. Think of it like this. A trade balance is mathematically tied to a country's savings and investment rates. The U.S. has a relatively low household savings rate and high investment, so it naturally imports capital and goods. China, on the flip side, has this incredibly high household savings rate, historically over 30%, which naturally leads to exports. Tariffs simply cannot magically rewire those underlying domestic financial habits. And that's exactly why the macroeconomic reality ended up sharply diverging from the initial policy intent.
Moving on to part two, real manufacturing impacts. Stepping away from abstract macro theory and walking right onto the factory floor, the double-edged sword of protectionism becomes super clear. On the U.S. side, the ledger of pain was very real. See, American manufacturers rely heavily on imported components, so those tariffs basically acted as a massive tax on their inputs. That meant higher manufacturing costs and ultimately higher prices for everyday consumers. And instead of sparking this massive domestic manufacturing boom, supply was just diverted from China to higher-cost foreign producers. Meanwhile, over in China, the pressure was equally brutal. Industrial output growth slowed down, their currency faced depreciating pressure, which made it way harder for businesses to service their debt, and factory owners were under immense pressure to literally pack up and shift their production lines to other countries just to survive. I think this analysis from the United Nations hits the nail on the head, stripping away all the political spin perfectly. Quote, "The U.S. tariffs on China are economically hurting both countries." End quote. Strictly speaking, from an economic standpoint, there were no clear victors here. These tariffs just introduced massive friction into systems that were already highly optimized, leaving both sides with significant economic damage. All right, let's look at Section 3, multinational supply chain reshuffle. Faced with crushing tariffs and just constant unpredictability, how did global businesses actually react? Well, they moved. Academic researchers tracking firm disclosures pinpointed 244 discrete corporate relocation decisions made by 141 different manufacturers between 2018 and 2023. This wasn't some minor temporary adjustment. We're talking about a fundamental rewiring of decades of highly efficient global production networks. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were suddenly on the move. Now, the really crucial point here is how they relocated. The whole political goal was reshoring, right? Bringing those factory jobs back to the United States. But the data tells a vastly different story. Only 15.6% of these moves were true reshoring back to the US. Instead, a massive 66.4% adopted what economists like to call a China plus many strategy. So they didn't bring production home to America, they diversified it across multiple other developing nations. That way they could dodge the tariffs while still keeping their labor costs low.
And the undeniable winner of this massive reshuffle? Southeast Asia. Vietnam alone captured 75 of those 244 corporate moves, becoming the unintended primary beneficiary of the whole US-China economic conflict. Thailand, Malaysia, and other ASEAN nations also saw huge influxes of foreign direct investment and manufacturing capacity. Basically, companies were just scrambling to find a safe harbor outside the tariff blast radius. When researchers actually asked these companies why they were moving, especially at such an immense cost, the answers were super telling. Yes, the direct hit from tariff increases was a major factor, obviously, but cited just as frequently was the geopolitical risk and uncertainty. You know, businesses thrive on predictability. The constant threat of sudden tariff escalations totally forced their hands. They realized they had to mitigate future supply chain shocks, even if that meant completely abandoning highly efficient Chinese manufacturing hubs. This whole dynamic birthed an incredibly complex workaround that we call transshipment. Because, as we've seen, the trade between the US and China didn't just vanish. A ton of it simply got rerouted. Let me break down how this new supply chain works. First, Chinese components are exported to ASEAN nations. Then, minimal final assembly, or honestly sometimes just relabeling, happens in a factory in Vietnam or Thailand. Finally, that product gets exported to the US, completely bypassing the direct bilateral tariffs. The global supply chain didn't break, it just got longer, less efficient, and significantly more expensive.
Which brings us to Section 4, long-term global trade costs.
Zooming back out to the macro level, we have to ask, what are the permanent scars this economic conflict is leaving on the world? Because the fallout extends way beyond Washington and Beijing. We are looking at a system burdened with increased corporate operating costs, mainly because companies are forced to build these redundant backup supply chains. All that friction directly fuels rising inflation for everyday consumers. On top of that, we're seeing a rising geopolitical risk premium slapped onto global investments. But really, the most profound impact is the permanent fragmentation of global value chains. That seamless, highly integrated global economy we all knew in the 2010s, it's fracturing into distinct, overlapping, and very cost-heavy blocks. To put a hard number on this systemic drag, economic forecasts indicate that the 2025 tariff escalations alone, those massive 145% and 125% spikes we talked about earlier, are expected to cause a 0.2% loss in total global merchandise trade. Now, 0.2% might sound like a tiny fraction, but in the context of the massive global economy, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in lost economic activity, stifled growth, and missed opportunities all over the world. So, this leaves us with the ultimate question of this entire economic ledger. Who really pays the price?
When politicians push for tariffs, they usually claim that the opposing country is footing the bill. But as we've just seen from the data, the disrupted supply chains, and those rising manufacturing costs, the undeniable conclusion is that the unintended consequences of protectionism leave the global consumer holding the bag. A fragmented global economy just means permanently higher costs. The tariffs didn't fix the underlying macroeconomic imbalances, and they definitely didn't bring all the manufacturing back home. Instead, they rewired the entire world, making it a little less efficient and a whole lot more expensive for all of us. So, as you look at the goods you buy every day, or even the industry you work in, you have to wonder, how is your own sector adapting to this fragmented new reality, and where exactly will the next domino fall? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.